I'm going to give you a rundown on Indian ink. This one in particular is done by Royal Talens. This cute half-ounce bottle is the perfect size for dipping and even has a plastic quill on the cap. India ink is traditionally made out of animal glue, carbon black, and water. The carbon pigment came from soot, most of which was obtained from burning oils, bones, or woods like pine. Royal Talens used to be called the Dutch factory for paints, lacquers, and inks back in 1899. Their Indian ink is a combination of highly light-fast pigment plus shellac. Now that we have an idea of the backstory, I'm going to begin by showing you some of my favorite simple techniques that are great for beginners. So feel free to follow along with me. There's a link below to download the sheet of black cats that we're going to be doing the ink lining and wash techniques on together. Instead of learning how to use these techniques in boxes, I figured that black cats would be a lot more fun. So feel free to print off the sheet and use a light box to transfer to a heavier weight paper, or you can even use it on that lighter weight printer paper as well. Whichever paper you choose is going to affect how the ink washes and lines look. If you don't want any texture, try a hot press or Bristol paper. Always remember to shake your ink before using, and I also like to have a palette off to the side so that I can dilute the ink with a little bit of water for some of the techniques. There are a lot of different ways that you can line with India ink. I prefer a very small round or a long lining brush. Either one of these will work just fine. The only difference between the liner and the small round is that the liner is going to hold a little bit more ink, and the small round you'll have to dip back into the ink bottle more often. Lining is pretty self-explanatory with these small brushes. You're just going to want to make sure that your ink has enough time to dry before putting your hand over it, so it does help to start in the opposite direction of your dominant hand. For example, if you're right-handed, you start at the left top side of the page and move to the right bottom. The ink does dry waterproof, so we're going to be able to put the line down and have no worries about that line smudging or moving at all as we add extra layers over top. Another type of brush I'd like to introduce to you as well, if you're interested in doing a lot of inking with a liner type brush, is something called a rigger brush. This brush is essentially a liner, however it has a larger kind of round base to it. You can't judge this brush when it's dry, you must see it wet. And essentially this is going to hold a lot more ink in the belly of the brush and come to a really nice point. Therefore, you're able to do a lot of lining without having to dip back into the bottle of ink. This is my go-to brush for doing things like comics where I know I'm going to have to be lining a lot with a liquid ink. Lining with ink and getting a consistent dark line is pretty simple. You don't have to dilute your ink to make it liquid. You can use the full strength of the ink to get a consistent solid black line. If you do want variation in the line, just add a little bit of water and then you'll get some areas that are darker and lighter depending how much water is mixed into the ink. You can also do things like breaking up the ink line edge. For example, here, I'm adding some breaks in the line in kind of a shaggy, loose manner to make it look like the cat has longer hair. If you're new to ink, this is a great way to practice and figure out what you like and what works best for you. Another way to line is by using a dip pen. These dip pens can all look different. This one in particular is made of glass, and essentially what it does is it just funnels the ink down to a very fine point and allows for a precise line. So if you're interested in doing a very technical form of lining and adding very fine lines into your artwork with ink, then these dip pens might be the way to go. I personally prefer the glass ones because I think that they're very easy to use and also to clean, but they also make other ones that basically are a holder with interchangeable nibs. No matter what art utensil you prefer, I think my best piece of advice for inking lines is to hold that utensil pretty close to the actual paper. The further up you hold it, either it be close to the ferrule of the brush or the tip of the dip pen, you're going to get more control. The further back your hand sits on the utensil, the less control you're going to have. So there's many different options, but these are just the ones that I prefer. And although these are not Indian ink, I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Microns because they're available in many different sizes and they're very user-friendly. They also dry waterproof and they're pretty dark black, so they work very well with Indian ink. If you need a consistent, easy to place line, these Microns are going to be a great addition. Next, I'm just going to use an eraser to get rid of any unwanted pencil lines. Of course, it is important to make sure that your ink is fully dry before erasing. Otherwise, you can smudge ink if it has puddled up and you haven't noticed. But here's the end result of the lined cats. And again, if you are interested in doing the ink techniques along with me, you can always print out this page at a lower opacity and ink right over top, or you can also just do the ink wash techniques, which I'm going to be showing you next. But before I do that, I'm going to use a little bit of liquid masking film to do a resist technique. This is a wonderful idea if you want to preserve any whites of your paper while you are inking. Liquid masking film, also known as frisket, is going to resist any of the products from absorbing into the paper. So it's essentially a type of latex and it will sit on top of the paper. The most important thing is to apply it evenly and then wait for it to fully dry. Then you're going to add the ink on top. You again have to wait for that ink to fully dry, but once it is, you can just use your finger to remove any of that frisket. You can also use something like masking tape, but sometimes I don't always get the best result out of that. And this way, with their eyes masked, we don't have to worry about accidentally losing the white of their eyes. So let's get right into it. The first technique is wet on wet, and essentially what you're going to do is wet your paper using a clean brush with clean water. Once your paper is saturated with a nice even sheen all the way across, you're just going to either take a pipette or a brush filled with ink and drop it into whatever you want the ink to be the darkest within that puddle of water. The ink will only expand wherever the area is wet. This is a very useful technique because it allows you to have an organic, free-flowing look that is within the confines of a very particular area. And the reason I didn't fully outline the cat's face shape is because I wanted to show you how you can drag your ink over to create diffused lines and edges on wet paper. Edges are a very important element of art, and not everything has to be fully outlined with a black line all the way around. You can also have those soft edges with just a little bit of extra water mixed into your ink. Wet on wet refers to the wash technique, but we're also doing something else here, which is just a bit of a technicality, but I also want to talk about it. When you are using the wet on wet technique, you are also doing something called charging, but you can also charge without doing the wet on wet technique. As you can see, I have this wet area in the cheek, and I'm using my brush to drop more ink into that area. So I'm charging that area. It's a little bit more particular than the wet on wet wash, and it's used in situations where you have a wet mixture already on the paper and you need to add a little bit of a darker contrast or more color into that particular area. These techniques go hand in hand, and if you are a fan of the wet on wet technique, then you're probably doing a little bit of charging without even knowing it. So these are really fun ways to get some interesting ink designs down without having to do too much effort. This next technique is going to be a flat wash, and typically you'd use a flat brush, but this time I'm going to use an angle wash brush so that I can get into the nooks and crannies of the shape. I like to add a little bit of water to my ink for this step because I want to keep that ink as wet as possible to try to even out my wash. You can, again, manipulate it while it's still wet and just try to spread the ink the best you can as quickly as you can. Of course, if you're going to do a flat wash over a large area, it'll be a lot easier than doing something that's a little bit more complex like this shape. Because of the shellac in the ink, it dries extremely quickly, so the area right by the cat's tail you'll see is already dry and has created an edge. So I'm just using a little bit of wet ink from the middle to try to push it over, and I have a little bit of a line right here that's kind of separating the two. So what I'm going to do is just finish trying to spread my ink, and then I will come back in and do another layer on the low points of the ink to try to balance it out just a little bit. Typically, flat washes are used to cover large areas, and you can even have it be a flat, one tone, or you can have something called a graded wash, which actually blends from darker to lighter. Typically, for a small area like this, in order to do a flat wash, I would just pre-wet the area, drop in some ink, and move it around to try to get it as even as possible. Glazing is a common technique that uses transparent layers to build on top of each other to create a darker value. If you're using this with black ink, then you're going to need to apply plenty of water between each step to keep up that transparency. However, if you're using colored Indian ink, then you can actually optically blend by using glazing instead of blending on a palette or the page. The key is to keep your layers very transparent, and you'll have full control over how it looks because it builds up gradually. Do make sure that your paper is fully dry before your next layer of glazing. Otherwise, you're just blending on the paper instead of glazing. And the one thing that you do need to be careful about is that the shellac will build up on the paper and it will actually repel the water. So to counter this, just make sure you have plenty of water mixed in with each layer. This technique is going to probably give you the most control out of all of these washes, and it's called wet on dry. Wet referring to the mixture of ink and water on your brush, and dry referring to the surface of paper. This way you have full control over where your ink is going and what it is doing. The drier the paper, the more the ink will sit wherever you place it. Notice the clean, crisp edges we get as opposed to the diffused wet edges that we got when we were working on that wet paper. If you're doing the wet on dry technique, if you'd like to, you can also follow behind your inked area with a wet brush to spread it out and move it around. This is a technique that is referred to as dragging. So as you'll see, the wet ink is on the page and then I just follow behind it with a wet brush, and that way I'm able to pull and push that ink wherever I want it to go. This will help you create seamless blends, or perhaps if you just need some more ink or contrast in a certain area, dragging is a great technique to make that happen. One more technique that I wanted to point out on this cat is one called lifting. If you have a wet area like this cat's chest that you want to be lighter, you can clean out your brush and you're going to want to keep it pretty dry. But you can actually go back over that area that's already wet and lift some of that ink out. So you're not going to be able to go all the way back down to the white of the paper, and also if that area of the ink is already dry, you won't be able to lift. But if you make a mistake and that ink is still wet, you do actually have the opportunity to lift that ink out. Besides lifting, there are a couple other ways that you can use the dry brush. My favorite way is just to dip that brush directly into the ink and then on a paper towel to get kind of a jagged edge. I will follow behind with another dry brush, one that hasn't been dipped in ink, and kind of blend that ink outwards. This is a technique called dry brush, and there's a couple different ways to do it. On its most basic, simple form, dry brush is just a brush that's going to be dipped into paint without any additional water, to make sure that those bristles stay as dry as possible and also give you a really nice kind of painterly jagged edge. So depending on what type of brush you're using will actually give you a different result. Try using a hog bristle for a more linear look, or if you have any brushes that are kind of destroyed and on their way out the door, these brushes are perfect for that dry brush technique. And since we're on the topic of destroyed brushes, to keep your current brushes from becoming those ugly brushes, be sure to put your brush or utensils in the water while using the India ink. Because of that shellac in the ink, it dries very quickly, and if it dries within your brush, then it will potentially destroy it because it is very hard to clean out once it is dry. So between using, just keep it submerged in water or rinse it off immediately after use. Stippling is a nice technique if you like a lot of control, and depending on what tool you use to stipple, you're going to get very different results. But it's pretty straightforward. All you're going to do is make a lot of little dots. And the more little dots you pile up on top of each other, the darker the area will be. And of course, the more spread out the dots are, the less contrast you're going to get in that area. So you can slowly and systematically build up your value that way. Earlier I was using a wet brush, which gave me a much larger dot. Then when I switched to a dip pen and followed through with a micron, I got a variety of very small dots. The only thing you need to watch out for while using the stippling technique with either a brush or a dip pen is that you may get a drop of ink that carries down the utensil and falls off. So just be very careful that you don't have too much ink on your utensil while stippling. And that's why for the most part, I really like to use the micron for stippling smaller dots because you have that quick, continuous ink reservoir and you don't have to worry about all those little dots. You can be much faster and careless with it. This next one is going to be saran wrap, and trust me when I say this is the most fun you'll ever have with this stuff. I like to use a larger piece and crumple it up and then pull it out a little bit. The more you crumple it up, the more interesting folds and bends you're going to get in your wash. To start, I'll do a simple wash on the area that I want to have the saran wrap texture. And the key here is to work quickly, because you want to place the saran wrap on the wash while it is still wet. So you'll see I keep going back through and adding some darker ink areas into the wash just to give it more variation. Once I think that there's enough ink on there, I'm just going to use my other hand to put that saran wrap down while it's still wet, and I'm going to lightly press it and then just leave it. I like to leave it for about 10 minutes so that it can fully dry. You don't have to press anything down heavy on it, it's okay if it lifts up just a little bit, and we'll check on this once it's all dry. Next up we have the sponge technique, and today I'm going to be using the sea sponge. This one's a lot of fun because you can get so many different variations of patterning throughout with just one simple piece of sponge. So you'll see here I'm using the ink with just a little bit of water in it, and for this next part I'm going to add a lot more water into my ink. And that way I'm getting much more wet kind of look out of this sponge and also that lighter stamp as well. So you can use the sponge to push the ink around, or you can just stamp it directly onto the paper to get some really fun kind of wet puddles within your piece. Alternatively, you can use the ink with no water in the sponge, and you're going to get a much more dry appearance that will cover less area, and it will be more intricate. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use sponges, and they're wonderful if you're ever doing anything that's kind of like foliage, kind of like a tree, or in this case, a calico cat situation. Last but certainly not least, we have the salt technique. And again, this is going to start with a very simple wash, and depending on what type of salt you're using, you're going to get different results. So I'm going to show you a little bit of both. Up top here, I used a coarser salt that's going to be a lot thicker, and then down below and up in the tail, I'm using a finer salt. And essentially what the salt does to the ink is it soaks it up, and it leaves a white ring around wherever the salt landed. So once you place your salt, try your best to not agitate it. Keep it in that same place, and then you're going to have that really clear example of where that salt soaked the ink up. I love using salt because it gives you a unique random pattern, and it's a fun way to get some organic details into the background, or perhaps even where you want to just add a little bit of extra interest. Now you have to wait for the ink and the salt to fully dry. So for this, I like to let it sit for at least a good 20 minutes just to make sure that I'm not going to smear it while I'm wiping the salt away. I also do want to mention that with all of these techniques, if you don't like how it came out the first time, you can actually go over it again because that ink is waterproof and you can repeat the technique. Now that all of our ink is dry, I'm just going to remove that frisket, followed by removing the salt and saran wrap. And theoretically, you could just stop inking right there, but if you did happen to make a mistake, then you can use any of these white products to cover that mistake up. Essentially, all you're going to need is a white opaque art product to sit on top of that ink layer. Depending on the product, you may have to do 2 passes for it to fully cover. This is a great way to clean up any overlap that you may have over an edge, or just to add highlights in general. In that way, if you're transferring your design to a digital format, perhaps scanning it, then it will make the editing aspect a little bit easier to have any mistakes hidden with that white ink. You can also hide mistakes with that white ink and then add a little bit of black India ink on top. So there are ways to fix accidents that may happen throughout. And now that we have all of our techniques done, we can kind of look at them collectively. Look at the variety of mark making techniques that you can do with just one simple product like India ink. Now I'm going to show you a couple ways in the main illustration on how you can actually combine multiple simple techniques together. So now that we have learned all of our techniques, I wanted to show you how you can apply that within a painting, and I'm not going to use all of them, but I want to show you practical ways for how you can use them in your own illustrations. I'm sketching this image in the same journal that I did the basic techniques in. Again, it is a cold press, so it's going to have a little bit more texture. And not only that, it's also a watercolor paper, so it's going to absorb the ink quicker and make it dry faster. So the paper that you're drawing or using your ink on is going to have a big impact on how the ink actually performs. And one thing I really do admire about doing sketches for ink is that I know I'm going to be doing that ink on top, and so I don't have to worry about any blended or smeared graphite or anything like that. I can leave my sketch pretty loose and rough whereas if I was doing a watercolor on top of this, I'd have to clean it up substantially. So I'm going to start off with the liquid masking film to do a little bit of resist, particularly in the eye and whisker area, just because I don't want to lose those whites. And I'm going to start off with doing some really sloppy wet on wet washes. And I'm not painting particularly from a photo reference for this. I'm painting from a collection of different references of my sister's cat and also some pictures that I found online. So now that we have all of our frisket in place and everything's dry, I just want to show you a little bit of my setup because I didn't go too much over this in the beginning. Of course, you can use Indian ink directly out of the bottle, and if you're going to do that, this is a great bottle for that because you can't overextend your brush dipping into it and potentially get it up in the ferrule. But I like to use a pipette and put different amounts in different wells of the palette and then follow behind with a little bit of water so I can control the amounts of ink to water ratio. I think it depends on what kind of artist you are, if you're more like a cook or a baker, how specific you are with your measurements and stuff like that. But for me, it's just a little bit of magic, whatever I'm feeling, and I can always adjust it as I go. So now that our frisket is fully dry, you'll see that I'm going to begin by doing a wet wash with just water and no ink. Now I'm dipping into my ink palette and I'm putting down a 40% black ink. I'm using a lot of extra water so that it can travel around and do some cool, fun, different things on its own. Because I have those whiskers masked off, I don't have to worry about those at all. I'm just painting right over top and using my wet brush to drag that ink around. Even though I'm using the wet on wet technique, which is normally pretty random, I'm still looking at my photo references because I want to drop that ink into the wet areas to become the darkest areas, and then let the ink spread naturally on its own. I'm also using a water mister here just to keep it super wet, and also get the areas around it nice and wet. It's a great method to have soft, diffused edges and not get any hard lines. Especially when painting fur, you want to make sure everything looks very soft and diffused, and then that way you can build it up incrementally. And like I mentioned earlier with the wet on wet, you can always go back in and do another layer on top of that. And you can use the wet on wet technique. So even though it looks like you don't have a lot of control, you can actually control it quite a bit by building it up slowly. All you have to do is work quickly while that ink is still wet. And for the rest of the body, you'll see I'm doing some wet on wet techniques, but I'm also using a little bit of wet on dry, dragging, and charging. Overall, I'm just keeping things pretty wet and loose. And for one thing I wanted to mention about the wet on wet in this piece in particular is I actually opted to use a watercolor brush so that I could keep my edges very soft as opposed to straight and sharp. And that's okay to do, but just keep in mind that if you're using a soft-haired watercolor brush, do not leave it flat on the table because the ink will dry and ruin it. Just as we talked about earlier with the dry brush, the type of brush you're using is going to have a very big impact on the brush strokes. And speaking of dry brush, you're going to see me doing a lot of dry brush and dragging here on the arms and legs. So I think that this is a really cool technique for ink, so I slowed it down a little bit for you guys. But I'm going through with a wet filbert, and then I'm just using my dry brush to drag that ink away. And it's adding a really soft kind of hair-like texture to the ink. It helps that I have the other layers beneath it establishing a value, and then I'm able to go through and plug in a darker value using my wet brush, and then I'll just use my dry brush technique to drag it wherever I want. That way it gives us a little bit more of a fur texture, and if we use that in enough places, it'll be a kind of convincing fur coat with just a one-dimensional color. If you're new to India ink, this is a great exercise to paint something that is completely black because it gives you kind of a hyper-aware sense of all the values, and it makes it easier to work from a photo reference that's just going to be grayscale, like you're painting. I also want to give you some general advice on doing ink paintings. And essentially, I always like to start by plugging in my darker areas. But when I do that, I don't go 100% fully dark on those areas. I probably go about 80%, even if I think that they're the darkest areas on the painting. Then, when I fill in the areas around it, I'll have a better idea of how dark the darkest spots are. It's important to bring it all up at the same time so that you are able to figure out your values because the values surrounding an area are definitely going to dictate how dark or how light a particular area is. And while working with ink, once it dries, it's waterproof, you have it down, and you basically have to live with it unless it's wet enough that you can lift it and you notice immediately and you want to change it. So you have to be a little bit more calculated when using ink, and that's why it's nice to slowly bring it up and start with those darker areas and then refine the areas around it, just to make more informed decisions. So as you can see, the cat's already starting to take shape, and that's just by using the very techniques that we just learned together. And it's allowing me to get a pretty complex image done. And that's one of the things that I love about ink. It's just very versatile. So for my flowers here, I don't have any reference. I'm just making these up out of my head. So I'm keeping them very loose and illustrative because I don't want them to distract from my cat. And after painting a couple flowers, I decided it was time to remove the frisket on the flower in front of the cat, so I could paint that at the same time too. And for my flowers, I'm starting off very loose with wet washes, and I want that ink to travel around the paper and do unpredictable, very fluid looking things, because I think having the texture of the dry fur with the really dark parts of the cat is going to pair really nicely with the soft, kind of whimsical look of the flowers. I also want to mention that the thicker you use your ink, the more chance you have to get a glossy finish on some of the areas. And that's just because of the shellac that's mixed in with the pigment and the ink. It really bothers some people. It does not bother me at all. But if you want to avoid that glare, just be aware of how thick you're using the ink. And if you don't want that shine, you can just add a little bit of extra water into each layer to avoid that. One more thing that I also wanted to address is kind of about the backstory of India ink, just as a side note. Essentially, Indian ink, India ink, and Chinese ink are all referring to the same type of ink, although there are slight differences between them. And it's very confusing, but I think it's a geographical thing where different regions refer to the ink under different names, and also different brands refer to the name of ink in different ways. India ink also originated from China and has been around for a very long time, so that's just something to keep in mind while buying ink. Whatever you want to call it, I think that this ink is a timeless product, and I think it's definitely a staple for every artist studio. And I'm just finishing up my painting right now. The very last step is that you want to erase the initial pencil underneath, and it's going to leave us with a pretty clean looking painting with sharp contrast. I'm happy with how this one turned out. I think it's so whimsical and cute, and my sister will be excited about this painting of her cat named Garbage. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope that you picked up a tip or two along the way. Have a wonderful week.